Alright, I didn't mean to click on him, I was trying to click on the game. This is the post-epilogue, checking in with all the characters we've met along the way. I went through a couple of them at the end of my finale stream of Pyre. So Falcon Ron and Sandra are going to be in the end of that. I'm just gonna kind of go through the rest of them because I'm curious, but I also want to share how my particular playthrough of Pyre went for it all. So, if you play this game, of course you're gonna see some different outcomes, different characters will have been liberated. So yeah, this is just my portion of it. Sir Deluge never made it. So all his life, Sir Deluge had fled from one danger only to find himself facing another. He had escaped the war-torn waters of the Sea Dominion, he had escaped the blood border of the Commonwealth, and now he had escaped the rites. After the rites had ended, many exiles wrapped up in the ancient test were crestfallen as their last chances to return to their homes vanished along with the stars above. But Sir Deluge did not mind, for this outcome at last there was no burden of responsibility weighing down on him. While most of his fellow exiles of the Pyre Hearts yet longed for the waters of the Sea Dominion, driven as ever by their impulses towards conflict, Deluge settled down. With him remained one of his companies, one Lady Seagrass, who had taken a liking to him for some reason. What is wrong with you? Reportedly, they disappeared into the waters of Worm Gulf, which may begin to explain the significant increase in worm population observed in the vicinity. Oh boy. Well, it takes all kinds, I suppose. Let's see how Tizo's doing. Once the rites had ended, the imp Tizo had a job to do, quite unlike most exiles trapped forever in the downside. The lone minstrel asked that he watch over the black wagon, which the Nightwings had used extensively for travel and for shelter throughout their quest. Tizo obliged, for he knew that wagon, as well as its drive imp inhabitants, perhaps better than anyone. What became of the wagon exactly was never verified as evidence of Tizo's thorough work. After that, he liked to while away his days with any of his friends, or else with fellow imps. So the black wagon, it seems, was hidden away instead of used as transport and shelter by us permanently. Sandalwood sometimes called for his assistance, and Tizo was always happy to oblige. The two would often reminisce about their times with the lone minstrel. He often chirped about the reader of the Nightwings, with whom he built quite a rapport. The reader understood him perhaps better than anyone. Indeed, Tizo would often express wistful gratitude for all his time in with the Nightwings and their many adventures throughout the land that was always his home. Other than that, Tizo would sometimes help interpret for messenger imps, relaying news to and from the Saurian Union. Despite having gained significant celebrity abroad, he never let it go to his head. And he would go fishing in the Sea of Solace at every single chance he got. I'm glad for him. I think I might bounce through all the ones that didn't achieve freedom and then the ones that did, so... Dalbert. As the cycle of the rites drew to a close, it grew evident that a chance at freedom from the downside had forever slipped from Dalbert and Almer Oldheart's grasp. Thus they and the exiles of the Fate returned to Yomar Valley. There they struggled to get by as exiles of the downside tend to do. Sometime after the rites had ended, the Oldhearts at last heard the news that the Commonwealth had fallen. This was well after the fact, of course, but it brought old Dalbert great joy. Despite his forthright manner, he had no love for the nation that cast him down along with his son. Dalbert Oldheart passed peacefully in his sleep before the next new moon. In his final days, he implored his son to undertake a pilgrimage to the scribes. Almer never shared his father's view of the scribes, but respected Dalbert's wishes. And so, after a period of mourning, Almer began a new journey. Not a day went by that Almer Oldheart did not think about his father and give thanks to him, and speak to him at morning and at night. Would that the stars yet shone, for surely Dalbert's would be there among them, smiling down at his son and watching over him and his kin. After the final liberation rite, Lendl refused to believe that the rites had truly ended. He would sit through night after consecutive nights, staring into the blackness of the sky, awaiting any kind of sign that he might gain another chance at freedom. No such sign ever came. His fellow accusers started to express concern for him. Survival had become their top priority once liberty had been slipped from their grasp. But Lendl dismissed them as weak fools. He insisted rather forcefully that any evening now the stars would shine for him again, and mark the way toward his inevitable freedom. He was, of course, mistaken. The others in his triumvirate were left with little choice but to abandon him. After that, the exile known as Lendel the Liar was never seen again. However, there have since been sightings of a bedraggled demon who wanders the downside and bears Lendel's cruel countenance, suggesting he yet lives. After the cycle of the rites had ceased, Witch Udmilde returned to the Flagging Hands region, where she sealed herself within the Pit of Militha. There, even her fellow exiles of the Withdrawn allegedly grew unnerved after a time and left her to her vile work. Sometime later, the Pit of Militha erupted into flame, so intense was the conflagration that it could be seen all the way from Yomar Valley. Arson was suspected, though the cause was never verified, and many bog dwellers in the region were forced to flee. A tempest blowing from the north finally quenched the flames. When at last the ashes settled and the grounds had cooled, the site of the fire was scarred beyond recognition. No trace of Witch Udmilitha could be found. As for the contents of the Pit of Militha, which notably included a profane object thought to be the remains of Islach, all of it was gone as well. Back in the Saurian Union, Udmilitha's repeated threats of the return of Islach were thoroughly investigated, and no credence was found to any of her claims. Barker Ashpaws never had much interest in returning to the Commonwealth, for he always found his bylaws to be stifling, so when the rites ended, he did not care, at first. He soon grew very bored. The rites had given his life a certain sense of structure he had always needed. He missed the raw anticipation of it all. He decided to continue conducting the rites for the thrill of it. He bent some of the rules and replaced some of the objects, but it was close enough. His packmates, the dissidents, proved more than happy to participate, and thus they ran against each other back in Yomar Valley. Gradually, other exiles familiar with the rites, as well as those who had not heard of it at all, started to take an interest. They ended up giving Barker Ashpaws some healthy competition. His old feud with Rookie Dreamtail ceased meaning anything to him, and he forgot all about it amid his new pursuits. Ultimately, even Barker Ashpaws, who had led such a directionless existence to that point, found something of a calling through the rites. Whether he took the rites less seriously than any other exile of his time, or more, was oft debated by those who watched him work. He just wants to play basketball. That's all. Okay, you. When Manly Tinderstoff realized the rites had ended and that he no longer could return to the Commonwealth through this ancient means, he was outraged. He cursed the scribes, spewing forth such a slew of blasphemy as to be very unbecoming of one of his high status and bearing. When at last he calmed himself, he focused all his energies on attempting to find another means of homecoming. He maintained regular contact with his wealthy family on the other side via Messenger Imp, and used their vast resources to explore other means of escape. He tried using an elaborate pulley system. He attempted to retrofit a flying black wagon with superior propulsion. He tried an imp raft, a hot air balloon, even prayer. Nothing worked. There was only one way to escape the downside, and now it was gone. Oh god, Tinderstoff bankrupted his family in these vain attempts. At last, such was his shame that he retreated to the teeming woods of Black Basin, to Cinderroot. There he yet wallows, complaining to his comrades of the chastity who still put up with him, either about his own misfortune or the latest news from the other side. Makes sense. Once it became clear to Ignarius that the rites were drawing to a close, he knew that it was time for him and the Tempers to call it quits. But first he and the Tempers decided to celebrate, and that they did for many, many nights. The revelry did eventually subside. The exiles parted amicably, and went their separate ways. He roamed the downside then, searching for some meaning in his life, sometimes taking odd jobs requiring his brute strength. He never remained alone for very long, and took on many lovers in his time. However, he sometimes thought about the one he had called Curlyhorns, and what had become of her. Though his glory days as the most powerful conductor of the rites had long since passed, he always enjoyed the fearsome reputation he had cultivated at that time. I wonder if that would be any different if Jadariel was still around. Several exiles of the Nightwings cared more for the plan of Sandalwood than to return home from the downside. The crone called Big Bertrude was a prime example. She had found a suitable environment to live within the dismal region known as Flagging Hands. There she had built up a thriving place of business known to many exiles in the land. With the rites having ended, she returned to her preoccupations, working away almost as though nothing had happened. I figured she'd be perfectly fine staying put. When one gets to be more than 400 years of age, perhaps then even monumental events such as the culmination of the rites or the collapse of the Commonwealth are seen as trifling matters. Much of her effort was doubtless due to the influence of Sandalwood, someone whom she had admired now for decades. He had made clear that he could not requite her feelings for him, but what could have been a hurtful dismissal led only to a deeper understanding between them. She maintained an unlikely kinship with the harp, Pamitha Thane, whom she had known during their time together on the Nightwings. They each had different strategies for dealing with life's day-to-day annoyances, a subject that they both found vital, if not fascinating, to no end. By and large, Bertrude kept focused on her work. Whether casting small enchantments or imbuing talismans, the work brought her a sense of purpose, she would say. In the Commonwealth, such services were strictly forbidden, but in the downside, there was a real need for simple luxuries, which the competing slug market could not always provide. Thus did Big Bertrude continue to live up to her name, and the tales of her days within the Nightwings made her that much more the living legend. Without the helmet. After the rites ended, Pamitha Thane parted ways with the other Nightwings, stating that she needed time alone. She reappeared sometime after the fall of the Commonwealth, though she expressed mild surprise at the news. She claimed to have no knowledge of what went on, including what role the High-Winged Remnants had in the events that reshaped the world on the other side. For her part, Pamitha feigned little interest, making the point that they were stuck, and what happened elsewhere had little to do with them now. Someone with whom she kept in contact was the bog dweller called Big Bertrude. They would discuss all sorts of matters long into the night, and sometimes hunt together too. Pamitha never saw her blood sister again, though did hear of her. By some accounts, Tamitha played no small part in the historic last days of the Commonwealth. In turn, Tamitha must have heard something of her blood sister. However, she never responded to Pamitha's attempts to contact her. Pamitha did not expect forgiveness from her at any point. Nonetheless, she kept on trying to reach out, she said, to ruffle up her feathers just a bit. Having long since felt as though she had no home to call her own, Pamitha continued traveling about the downside. As the tempest swept across the land, changing its features, she found in it a sublime beauty, and in the starless nights, she could still see just fine. She said such travels tended to remind her of when she was younger and could fly, unfettered. Okay. When the cycle of the rites ceased turning, Volfred Sandalwood turned toward the starless sky and closed his eyes and prayed. It was all that he could do at that stage of his plan. He aspired to assemble with the liberated exiles, representing each of the 8 largest ethnic groups composing the population of the Commonwealth. They would stand together as a vision of the 8 scribes returned, inspiring the masses to embrace an older set of values from before the Commonwealth had tightened its grip. With the rites ending sooner than expected, this ideal scenario became impossible. Sandalwood's own freedom, for instance, was now forfeit, yet the plan did have contingencies. Word reached him that on the night of the scribe's return, which is, inspired by liberated exiles, the people of the Commonwealth demanded new leadership. Several of his fellow liberated Nightwings stood together and their voices echoed through the streets. It was vital to Sandalwood that this stand against the Commonwealth be peaceful in its nature, but this proved to be untenable, especially after the High-Winged Remnants appeared. There was speculation that their well-timed assault may not have happened by coincidence, though Sandalwood denied any involvement and regretted the bloodshed. Nevertheless, the main thrust of the plan had been achieved. Sandalwood kept busy after that, as much as possible, providing counsel from afar to those who would be at the forefront of the birth of the Saurian Union. Of course, being stranded in the downside meant that there was only so much he could do. Resting assured that the future of the nation was in capable hands, he turned his attention to the remaining exiles of the downside. They might never return to that new nation, but at least they could experience its triumphs and its struggles in some vicarious way, so he took to his old work, writing and printing. As literacy began to spread again throughout the Saurian Union, so too did exiles of the downside take to it. For his part, Sandalwood helped to teach as many as he could. More than that, he provided the material to read, a semi-annual report about the latest events both in the Saurian Union and the Downside. This periodical gave many exiles something to look forward to. One of his allies in all this was the imp Tizo, with whom he travelled all across the Downside. Sandalwood often cited Tizo as the wellspring of his own enthusiasm for a brighter future, such was the creature's spirit. He welcomed the company of the reader of the Nightwings at every opportunity, and counted her a trusted friend, and a keen editor. He was pleased to hear that his one-time friend Orlek had once more become a productive part of his society, yet he spoke little of their time together. As Wolfred Sandalwood gained more fame throughout this land for all his sacrifices and his contributions, it is said that he remained steadfast about two things. The first was that the cause itself ought to remain in focus. The freedom that the people had achieved, it was a gift to be cherished, a set of values that needed to be nurtured. The second point he made was that he himself had little to do with the outcome. He would often praise the exiles of the Nightwings who had stood with him, each in turn, by name. He never forgot any of them. One day, to commemorate his birthday, the people of the Saurian Union unveiled a monument, depicting him and the Nightwings as imagined in their prime. As imagined! Oh god, how inaccurate might it be? While Sandalwood did not learn of it until much later, it is said that he was moved to tears then by the gesture. It has since ensured that those of us with memories more fallible than that of Sandalwood likewise remember the achievements of his fellow former exiles and our cause. Okay. Only these last ones remain. Let's see what happened to Tamitha. As soon as possible after Tamitha Thane earned back her liberty, she rejoined her sisters of the Highwing remnants in the mountains north of the Commonwealth. The Commonwealth believed that someone such as she could be rehabilitated through years spent in exile. Instead, her hatred for her ancient enemies only intensified. On the night of the scribe's return, the Highwing remnants were poised to strike the Commonwealth in a decisive blow. They had received credible intelligence about the expected positions of the Commonwealth leadership and of specific weaknesses in the blood border defenses anticipated that night. After a surgical procedure, Tamitha could fly again, almost as well as prior to her exile. She insisted on spearheading the attack with a squadron of the Harp's finest. They descended on their foes exactly as planned. The chaos that had arisen in the streets of the Commonwealth that night made for an optimal diversion. Nonetheless, the battle took its toll. Many of Tamitha's sisters fell. She herself sustained many grievous wounds, but ignored them all and fought with a terrible fury. By dawn, the leaders of the Commonwealth had been eliminated, and Tamitha was limping back toward the mountains. She would never fly again. Soon after the fall of the Commonwealth, Tamitha attended a debriefing in which she learned her blood sister, Pamitha, was an accessory to the successful outcome. Tamitha was very skeptical of this. But so many of the Highwing remnants honored Pamitha that Tamitha soon accepted the prevailing opinion, though grudgingly at first. A messenger imp later arrived, bearing some sort of message seemingly from Pamitha. However, Tamitha turned it away. She forever resisted the impulse to forgive. After the rise of the Saurian Union, Tamitha Thane continued to serve as flight tactician, and remained respected and feared even among her kind. However, without a war to wage, she grew more distant even than usual. Those closest to her surmised that her inability to reconcile with her blood sister was at the heart of this, though for her part, Tamitha never once admitted to any such weakness. In the aftermath of the final liberation rite, Orlek at last returned to his nation, one he had not seen in nearly 2 decades. He scarce recognized it. After all, it was in the midst of a transformation, a social and cultural upheaval, sparked by Wolfred Sandalwood's plan. When Orlek witnessed the people of the Commonwealth gathered in solidarity under the black sky there on the night of the scribe's return, he looked on in silence for a time. Then the Highwing remnants descended, and a panic quickly spread among those gathered. A pitched battle erupted in the streets. It was chaos. Orlek observed all of this, then took a step toward the fray. He knelt beside the closest injured man to him, staunched the man's bleeding and set an injured leg, then pulled him to a safer corner of the street. Orlek's old abilities as a physician had not left him during all his years. Thus did he aid as many as he could throughout the night, until the danger passed. History would know him as the Demon Doctor, a term of endearment that stuck even after his horns started to recede. He lent his skill and service throughout the birth of the Saurian Union. The one he had called the Shadow of the False Nightwings was someone whom he thought of often. He knew he owed his freedom to her. Having witnessed the aftermath of Sandalwood's plan, Aurelek understood at last what his former companion wanted. Years ago, they conceived a version of this plan. Now, Aurelek found he wished Sandalwood could be present to witness the reality of it. Alone with his thoughts, Aurelek would sometimes visit the memorial to the fallen leaders of the Commonwealth. Though, other than such appearances, and notwithstanding his duties as Master Physician of the state, Aurelek led a very private life. Few would have guessed that he once was one of the most accomplished rites conductors in the history of the Nightwings. History, of course, shall ensure we shall not forget. These last few. After Rookie Greentail earned back his freedom, he returned to a lavish welcome ceremony in the Commonwealth, as was the tendency for liberated exiles. It was everything he could have hoped for, and soon he was well off, surrounded by luxury and choosing between various exciting opportunities. However, he must have given in to his better judgment, as he did end up siding with Fulford Sandalwood's revolutionary forces, as he promised. On the night of the scribe's return, Greentail kept busy barking orders to Fulford's agents as the situation grew tenser. He took rather well to leadership. When dawn finally came and it became clear that the Commonwealth that everybody knew would be no more, he realized many new opportunities awaited. He began quite a lucrative career for himself, manufacturing and selling replica merchandise inspired by the downside. His main struggle was to meet demand. An aspect of his conscience cautioned him against making light of such a thing, but the money was too good, and soon his family was well off as he always said. He also kept in close touch with Gilman, ever the perfect practice partner. They would train together often, taking care to stay in tip-top shape as much as possible throughout the years. Greentail always did his best to keep in touch with all his many friends, and knew that he owed his fortunes to them. He made a special point of staying close with the group of friends he came to know so well during his time with the Nightwings, wherever they were. They shared a special understanding that even put Greentail at a loss for words sometimes. The Commonwealth had never provided a sense of home for the one they called Faye the Fair, so she was surprised on her return that she was so well treated. She felt uneasy about it, and besides, she knew that she would do her best to fulfill the pledge she had made to her friends. Even she could not have expected the impact she would have on the events that followed, which gave rise to our Saurian Union. Faye stood with the others on the night of the scribe's return. She did not take up arms, but spoke of the scribes with conviction and sincerity. Others were so caught off guard that it helped quell the danger of the situation. After the fall of the Commonwealth, there was a renewed interest in the legend of the 8 scribes, and many new interpretations of their histories and teachings. Faye found herself at the center of all this. Her way of speaking continued to compel a growing audience. She swayed many people from their astralist beliefs. Soon, the 8th Word, which had lost favor with the people during the reign of the Commonwealth, sought her out and asked her formally to join, and she did, right away. Through it all, she would wonder how her little friend Tizo had fared. While they were divided now by great distance, he always remained in her heart. She cited her relationship with Jodariel as the single most important in her life. Jodariel would always provide for her a circumspect perspective and the wisdom of experience. Faye always was devoted to her faith, but more so to her friends. Many people in the Saurian Union cited that her gentle manner and unwavering conviction helped them brave the changing times with courage and with grace. When the worm Gilman returned to the Commonwealth, he believed that he had regained something even more important than freedom, his honor. Gilman relinquished his knighthood and declined an opportunity to serve as captain on the Blood Border. He was not interested in fighting any longer. Yet, as is sometimes the case with those such as he, a circumstance soon came about in which there was a need for him to once again make use of his military training. He fought that night of the scribe's return. He fought with all his might. He faced other worm knights. He cared only for the cause. When the matter was at last put to rest, then Gilman truly knew his time as a knight had ended. He declared to all those in earshot that he would never fight again, and those within earshot was a great distance for him, I imagine. Unless, of course, there arose some other extraordinary set of circumstance again requiring him to fight, but he certainly hoped not. He still trained regularly, just in case, especially with his fleet-footed friend, Rookie Greentail. He was always grateful for having studied under the reader of the Nightwings, without whom he would never have completed his penance. Because of this, and perhaps because they were on opposite sides of the world now, Gilman dedicated his life to her. By that point, he had long forgotten about his days under the leadership of Sir Deluge, his former commander. Breaking free of his abusive leadership was the first step towards gaining a bit of self-respect. Gilman never did return to his homeland of the Sea Dominion, and was content to leave a monastic life on a small residence in the hills. It was just high up enough to make him keep striving to conquer his fear of heights. Other than that, an intense daily training regimen and the occasional visit from an old companion was more than enough to keep him optimistic and engaged. He knew by then that honor was not something to be won, but a contract with oneself to be renewed each day. After his liberation, Hedwyn was instrumental in the events leading to the fall of the Commonwealth and was vital to the outcome of the plan. He was the one who led the raid on the stronghold where Archjustice Androboles IX was holed up when the fighting grew fierce. With him, then and thereafter, was one of the winged harps of the High-Wing remnants later identified as Fikani Shang. Their bond was vital to the peace that followed. In all his days as a leader in the Saurian Union, Hedwyn oft confided in his friend Jodariel. Despite her intense manner, there was no one whom he trusted more in times when circumspection was required. Hedwyn would often think back about the vow he had made at the beginning of his quest for freedom. Although he cherished all the friendships he made, he had pledged to Jodariel, Rookie Greentail, and the Reader of the Nightwings that they might all be free again together. He had broken that vow, for in the end, not all of them were able to return. A terrible guilt over this darkened his mood for a time. However, the others whom he still knew lifted his spirits, much like he had often lifted theirs. All of the Nightwings knew the stakes. While the others who stood with the Nightwings were not all able to remain in contact thus, Hedwyn thought of each of them often, and so in turn, they oft think of him. After her liberation, Jodariel soon became an icon of the movement that led to the collapse of the Commonwealth and the rise of the Saurian Union. Her military prowess and experience led to key victories and clashes against the Commonwealth loyalists. Each time she was able to subdue the opposition, avoiding lethal force. In the uncertain times that followed, Jodariel's seasoned expertise often came into play both in matters of security and of state. For instance, she conscripted and trained a team of volunteers in public safety. The community did not know what to make of such a cordial bunch at first, but soon came to value their service. They have stood for the people ever since, and we celebrate their founding day each year. She remained close with Hedwyn all through this experience, and they supported each other through their struggles many, many times. She kept an eye on Faye, who, nonetheless, demonstrated a surprising knack to get by on her own, though Jodariel was always willing to provide assistance just in case. She never settled down with anyone, although from time to time she thought about Ignarius despite herself. She continued training on her own, a regimen that grew stricter with each passing year. There were those who sought to train with her, and she sometimes obliged. There remained one other constant in her life. She'd always remember her days among the Nightwings, and with fondness for the most part. The last two. After the cycle of the rites ceased turning, the lone minstrel bade the remaining Nightwings to take the Black Wagon and seek their fortunes elsewhere in the downside. Their parting was heartfelt, but brief. He remained there at the summit of Mount Elodiel, with Celeste, where the two of them would chronicle the final outcome of the cycle. Neither Tariq nor Celeste were ever seen again. We know all this now through song attributed to them. Some claim these songs originated in the taverns of the Saurian Union, and merely were imbued with the weight of folklore. However, exiles liberated from the downside corroborated each other's claims at having met this duo that presided over the liberation rites. Another folktale suggests these minstrels were heralds of the scribes. Having fulfilled their obligations, they departed the world we know and rejoined their patrons. One of their famous songs describes another, simpler outcome, that the two gave up their duties to the rites in favor of a life that they could share together. In any case, they are likely to remain the subject of such verses and such songs, for it was they who watched over the rites and ushered in our times. With that, there is one more account which warrants mention. The Nightwings conducted the rites under the guidance of a reader. Little is known of her. However, some accounts of her begin to paint a picture. We know she was of common birth, always directionless and prone to misremembering at times. The journey to the downside left her close to death. It was then that the Nightwings found her. They brought her from the brink. She showed them the path. She pressed onward with the others. She had made a vow to help her friends be free. Thus did the cycle of the rites commence its final turns. When the final rite arrived, the reader's freedom was at stake. In the end, however, she remained in exile. From that point on, accounts of her diverge. It is said the voice which troubled her she never heard again. Some say she opted for a place to settle in the downside, though whether that is true only she knows. Someday perhaps that reader's own star shall emerge. Then it shall pierce the dark of night in all its brilliant glory. Until such time, and ever after, all of us give thanks.